The words fell across the gaming table like a blade. Then I shall take the daughter. Dice stopped rolling. Cards froze in mid-air. Even the servants standing against the walls of the candlelit chamber seemed to forget how to breathe. Lord Edmund Bellamy did not lift his head at first. His hand rested on the cards before him, trembling faintly against the green felt of the table. Smoke drifted slowly through the private room at White's Club, where London's most powerful men had gathered to watch another gentleman's ruin unfold. "You cannot mean that," Bellamy said finally, his voice rough. Across the table, Lord Ashford smiled with slow satisfaction, the smile of a man enjoying someone else's misery. "Oh, but I do." Around them, velvet chairs creaked softly as the watching men shifted. Some stared at their glasses. Others pretended to study the cards in their hands. None of them spoke. Ashford tapped the stack of promissory notes resting beside the cards. "Your debts," he said lightly, "are considerable. Estate sold. Carriages gone. Credit exhausted." He leaned back comfortably. "But there remains one asset of value." Bellamy's voice cracked. "My daughter is not—" "Miss Margaret Bellamy is 23, Ashford interrupted smoothly. "Unmarried. Attractive enough." His smile widened. "I am a widower with a respectable estate. Marry her to me, and every debt disappears tonight." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even among men used to ruthless bargains, this felt obscene. A daughter traded for gambling losses. Bellamy's face turned pale. "You would humiliate her," he whispered. "I would marry her," Ashford corrected calmly. "A respectable arrangement." He pushed the papers across the table. "Refuse, and you lose everything." No one moved. No one interfered. In rooms like this, ruin was considered a private matter. Bellamy stared down at the table as if the wood might split open and swallow him. "My daughter," he murmured. And then a voice came from the doorway, cold, deep, controlled. "I will match whatever is on that table." Every head turned. Framed in the entrance stood a man whose presence changed the air in the room. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, the pale gray gaze of Maximilian Kingsley, Duke of Kingsley, swept slowly across the gathering. At 35, he was already a legend in London society. Ruthless in business, unmoved by gossip, feared by men who themselves inspired fear. Ashford straightened. "Your Grace," he said stiffly, "this is a private game. And yet half of London will hear of it by morning," the Duke replied calmly. He stepped forward. Each step carried the quiet confidence of a man who knew no one present would challenge him. The Duke stopped beside the table and looked down at the scattered cards. "Let us end this spectacle." Ashford's smile sharpened. "And why would your Grace involve yourself in Lord Bellamy's difficulties?" The Duke's gray eyes lifted slowly. "Because you are not interested in his daughter." A pause. "You are interested in watching him beg." The words landed with quiet precision. Ashford's jaw tightened. "I merely proposed a practical solution." "Yes," Kingsley said softly, "a cruel one." Without asking permission, the Duke pulled a chair forward and sat. "I will pay Bellamy's debts." Ashford laughed. "You presume too much." £20,000. The room went completely still. The sum was staggering, enough to restore the Bellamy estate entirely. Ashford's expression faltered. "And what do you gain, Your Grace?" he asked suspiciously. The Duke did not hesitate. "I will take the daughter." Shock rippled through the room. Bellamy lifted his head in stunned disbelief. Ashford leaned forward slowly. "You propose the same arrangement?" "No." Kingsley's voice grew colder. "I propose marriage with dignity, without humiliation." He met Ashford's gaze calmly. Or would you prefer the pleasure of bankrupting a gentleman more than the profit of £20,000? Ashford hesitated. Greed battled pride. Greed won. Very well, he said sharply. The debts are yours. The Duke rose smoothly. Good. Then he turned toward the broken man beside him. Lord Bellamy, he said quietly, we should speak privately. 20 minutes later, Edmund Bellamy stepped into the cold night air of St. James's Street with the hollow expression of a man who had exchanged one doom for another. He climbed into a carriage. Mayfair, he told the driver weakly, at that very moment. Inside the Bellamy townhouse library, Margaret Bellamy sat beside the dying fire, reading poetry. The room was quiet, except for the turning of pages. She sensed the moment her father entered, before she even looked up. Something in his silence felt heavy. She closed the book slowly. Father? He looked older than he had that morning. My dear, he whispered. What has happened? He swallowed. Our debts have been purchased. Her heart began to race. By whom? He hesitated. The Duke of Kingsley. The name stirred a faint memory. A tall figure glimpsed once at a ball. A man women whispered about. A man men avoided offending. That is fortunate news, she said carefully. Her father closed his eyes. No, his voice broke. It is not fortune. It is a bargain. Margaret's fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. What bargain? He forced the words out. He wishes to marry you. The room suddenly felt very quiet. And if I refuse? Her father said nothing. He did not need to. Refusal meant ruin. Servants dismissed. Her brother expelled from school. Her family destroyed. Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her. When does he expect an answer? He will call tomorrow. She nodded slowly. Then I shall meet the Duke. The Duke of Kingsley arrived the next afternoon, with the punctuality of a man who believed time itself should obey him. At exactly 2 o'clock, the rumble of carriage wheels echoed outside the Bellamy house. Margaret stood by the drawing-room window watching. The Kingsley crest gleamed on the carriage door. A footman opened it. The Duke stepped down. Even from the window she could feel the gravity of him. Tall, controlled, the sort of man whose presence altered every room he entered. Behind her, Lady Bellamy whispered nervously, Good heavens, he is even more intimidating in daylight. Margaret simply straightened her shoulders. A moment later, the butler announced him. His Grace, the Duke of Kingsley. The man who entered looked as though he had been carved from darker stone than the rest of the world. Black coat, perfect tailoring. His dark hair brushed his collar in a slightly careless way, but it was his eyes that held Margaret's attention. Cool gray, sharp as winter steel. They rested on her thoughtfully, not possessive, not dismissive, simply attentive. He bowed. Miss Bellamy. She curtsied. Your Grace. He declined tea with a quiet shake of his head and sat opposite her. Lady Bellamy positioned herself nearby as a silent chaperone. Kingsley folded his gloved hands. I believe your father has explained the situation. Yes. Margaret met his gaze calmly. You purchased my father's debts. And in return, she continued, you request my hand in marriage. I do. There was no hesitation in his voice. Margaret studied him. You speak of it as though we are negotiating a business contract. The Duke inclined his head. That is precisely what we are doing. Lady Bellamy gasped softly behind her. Margaret did not react. And what sort of marriage do you expect from such a contract, Your Grace? His gaze sharpened. You will become the Duchess of Kingsley. You will manage my household and represent my family with dignity. And in return, your family's debts vanish. Your estate is restored. Your parents receive an income sufficient to maintain their household. The offer was staggering. Security, stability, salvation. But Margaret asked quietly, "And affection?" For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. "I do not pretend to offer romance." The blunt honesty startled her. "You prefer truth to false promises." "Yes." Silence lingered. Then Margaret asked softly, "And children?" "Yes." His voice remained steady. "An heir will eventually be necessary." She folded her hands. "I will accept." Lady Bellamy dropped her book in shock. Margaret continued calmly. "On one condition." The Duke lifted an eyebrow. "Name it." "My brother George remains at Eton. His education continues uninterrupted." "Done. And my parents will want for nothing." "They will not." Margaret nodded. "Then we have an agreement." The Duke stood. "So we do." His expression softened slightly. "I will obtain a special license." Her breath caught. "So soon?" "Delay serves no purpose." He studied her face carefully. "We will be married by the end of the week." 4 days. In 4 days, she would belong to him. Legally, socially, completely. Before leaving, he spoke quietly. "You are not entering this blindly." Then he bowed. "Good afternoon, Miss Bellamy." The door closed behind him. Lady Bellamy collapsed into a chair. "The Duke of Kingsley," she whispered faintly. Margaret remained by the window. Her future had just been decided. A marriage without love. A husband feared across England. Yet strangely, she did not feel trapped. She felt as if she had stepped onto a road whose end she could not yet see. And somewhere in London, at that very moment, the Duke of Kingsley stood beside a window of his own house, thinking about the woman who had just agreed to become his wife. The wedding was held 4 days later beneath the pale arches of St. George's Church in Hanover Square. London society loved spectacle. There was none that morning. Only a handful of witnesses. It was not a celebration. It was the quiet execution of a bargain. Margaret walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. At the altar stood the man who had purchased her future. The Duke of Kingsley, tall, still, watching her approach. When the vicar asked for her vows, Margaret spoke clearly. "I do." The Duke repeated his vows with the calm certainty of a man signing a contract. When he slid the ring onto her finger, his hand was unexpectedly warm. "You may kiss the bride," the vicar said. The kiss was brief, formal, yet not entirely cold. And just like that, Margaret Bellamy became the Duchess of Kingsley. Later that evening, when the guests had gone and the house had grown quiet, the Duke turned to her. "We leave for Kingsley Park tomorrow morning." She nodded. "And tonight?" she asked carefully. "You may remain with your family if you wish." The unexpected kindness startled her. "I thought tonight would be our wedding night." His gaze darkened slightly. "It will be." A pause followed. "But not tonight." She blinked. "I thought you might appreciate one final night in familiar surroundings before your life changes." The kindness unsettled her more than cruelty might have. "Thank you," she said softly. "I will collect you at 9 tomorrow." He bowed slightly and left the room. Margaret stood alone in the silent house, trying to understand the man she had just married, a man feared across England, a man who had purchased her future, and yet a man who had chosen not to claim her at all. The journey to Kingsley Park took 2 days. Margaret spent most of the time watching the countryside through the carriage window. The green fields of England stretched endlessly across the landscape. Small villages appeared along the road and vanished again behind them. Sheep moved like drifting clouds across the hills. Inside the carriage, silence settled between her and the Duke. Maximilian worked through a stack of letters with calm concentration. Occasionally, he glanced up at her, as if making certain she was comfortable. "You may ask the driver to stop whenever you wish," he said once. "I am quite well," she replied. And strangely she was. The fear she had expected to feel was quieter now. It had not disappeared completely, but it no longer pressed against her chest the way it had on their wedding day. Late on the second afternoon, the carriage turned down a long tree-lined road. "Kingsley Park," Maximilian said simply. Margaret leaned closer to the window. The estate revealed itself slowly. First, she saw the lake shining beneath the late afternoon sun. Then the formal gardens spread across the hills like green silk. Finally, the house itself appeared. The mansion was enormous. Built from warm golden stone, it stood on a rise overlooking the land like a silent guardian. Margaret stared. "It is enormous." "Yes." Maximilian watched her expression carefully. "And it belongs to you." She turned toward him. "It belongs to us now," he corrected quietly. The carriage stopped beneath the grand entrance. A line of servants waited along the steps. Maximilian stepped down first and offered his hand. His grip was firm and steady. "Ready?" he asked. Margaret took a slow breath. "No," she thought, but she nodded. Inside, the entrance hall stretched upward toward painted ceilings and tall windows. Sunlight poured across the marble floor. What caught Margaret's attention most was the number of servants waiting. There were dozens of them. Housemaids, footmen, cooks, stable boys, all standing quietly in formation. Maximilian's voice carried easily through the hall. "Mrs. Thornton." A woman with iron gray hair stepped forward. Her posture was as straight as a soldier's. "This is Her Grace, the Duchess of Kingsley, Mrs." Thornton curtsied perfectly. "Welcome to Kingsley Park, Your Grace." "Thank you," Margaret replied. Mrs. Thornton's sharp expression softened slightly. "The Duchess's chambers are prepared." Maximilian turned toward Margaret. "You may rest after the journey. Dinner will be served at 8. "And you?" she asked. "I have matters to attend." Of course he did. The Duke of Kingsley never appeared idle. Her rooms were astonishing. They formed a suite overlooking the gardens. Soft cream walls reflected the evening light. Gold curtains framed the tall windows. The bed itself seemed almost too grand to be real. Mrs. Thornton gestured toward a door at the far wall. "This connects to His Grace's chambers." Margaret's stomach tightened, but the door remained closed. "His Grace rarely intrudes upon the Duchess's privacy," the housekeeper added calmly. The reassurance surprised her. Dinner that evening felt formal. Margaret sat at one end of a long table, while Maximilian sat at the other. Footmen moved silently between them. "Are your rooms satisfactory?" he asked. "Very much so." "Tomorrow Mrs. Thornton will explain your duties as Duchess." "I understand." The quiet between them returned. Finally, Margaret spoke. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you intervene that night at White's?" His fork paused in midair. "That question was inevitable." "You could have paid my father's debts without marrying me," she said. "Yes." "Then why did you not?" For a moment he did not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and careful. "I required a wife." The answer felt practiced. "And you believed a woman whose family was desperate would accept such a proposal?" "Yes." She studied him. Efficient. His mouth curved slightly. "You dislike the word. I dislike hearing marriage described like estate management. I never promised romance." "No," she admitted quietly. "You promised honesty. And honesty is what you shall always receive." After dinner, he excused himself to his study. Margaret returned to her rooms alone. Her maid had already prepared the bed. The connecting door between her room and the Duke's chambers remained closed. She changed slowly into her nightgown and slipped beneath the covers. Her heart beat faster. Tonight was truly their first night in the same house as husband and wife. At any moment the door might open. Her husband might enter. Minutes passed. Then an hour. The house grew quiet. The door never opened. Eventually sleep claimed her. Still alone. Still wondering why the Duke of Kingsley had chosen not to touch her at all. The first weeks at Kingsley Park settled into a quiet rhythm. Mornings were spent reviewing household accounts with Mrs. Thornton. Afternoons brought long walks through the gardens or hours in the vast library. Evenings meant dinner with the Duke, polite conversation, perfect civility. Yet every night the connecting door remained closed. At first, Margaret felt relieved. Then slowly curiosity replaced relief. Why did he keep his distance? One morning she wandered into the library. She stood near the tall windows, reading a book of poetry. "Wordsworth again." The deep voice behind her made her start. She turned. Maximilian stood in the doorway, dressed in riding clothes. His dark hair was slightly windblown. For once, he looked almost relaxed. "I enjoy poetry," she said. "As do I." He stepped inside and lifted another book from the shelf. "Byron," he said thoughtfully. "A man with dangerous ideas about love. And you disagree with him?" "Not entirely." He glanced toward her. The silence between them stretched. Then he asked quietly, "Are you content here, Margaret?" The use of her name surprised her. "I have everything I need." "That is not what I asked." She hesitated. "I am adjusting. You are lonely." It was not a question. She looked down at the book in her hands. "You have been very correct with me," she said carefully. "Correct," he repeated. "That is a polite word for distant." She did not argue, because it was true. Maximilian set the book aside. "When I arranged our marriage, I believed distance would make things easier for you." "Easier?" "You had no choice in becoming my wife. The least I could offer was time." The realization struck her suddenly. "You stayed away for my sake." "I stayed away," he said quietly, "because I would not have you share my bed out of obligation alone." Her heart skipped. "And if I never wished to?" "You would remain Duchess of Kingsley regardless." The certainty of the answer stunned her. No anger, no wounded pride. Only calm acceptance. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Maximilian cleared his throat. "There is something I hoped you might do with me tomorrow." "What is that?" "Ride." She blinked. "Ride?" "Yes." A small smile touched his mouth. "I should like to show you the estate properly." The invitation warmed her unexpectedly. "I would like that very much." The next morning they rode together across the vast lands of Kingsley Park. Fields rolled across the hills. Tenant farms dotted the countryside. Maximilian kept his horse beside hers. "This land supports more than 300 families," he explained. "Every harvest affects them." "You carry great responsibility," she said. "It is the burden of titles." She studied him. "And yet you seem happier here than in London." "I despise London." The bluntness made her laugh softly. He looked at her with surprise. "You laugh easily." "Only when something is amusing." He shook his head slightly. "You are unlike anyone I have ever known." They rode quietly for a while. Then he spoke again. "I served briefly in Crimea." She looked at him sharply. "I did not know that." "It changes a man," he said simply. "When you see death often enough, society begins to feel hollow." She studied him thoughtfully. "You are not cold." "No." "You are careful." He looked at her as if the words had startled him. No one has ever said that to me before. Perhaps no one bothered to notice. Something shifted between them then. When they returned to the house hours later, the distance between them felt smaller. And that evening, instead of retreating to his study, the Duke remained in the library while Margaret played the piano. When she finished, he spoke quietly. "Beethoven. I play adequately. You play beautifully. You distrust compliments," he observed. "Perhaps." Their eyes met across the room. The silence felt different now. Curious. Warmer. As if both of them had begun to wonder something dangerous. What if this marriage was slowly becoming something real? London greeted them with whispers. By the time the carriage rolled into Grosvenor Square at the start of the season, the entire city seemed to know the story again. The Duke who bought a wife. The daughter sold to pay a gambler's debts. Every drawing room repeated it. Every ballroom waited to see it. Margaret felt the weight of those whispers the moment they entered the Devonshire ball. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead. Silks brushed softly against polished floors. Music floated through the air as hundreds of guests moved across the enormous room. Conversation dipped the moment the Duke of Kingsley entered with his Duchess on his arm. Maximilian paused beside the doorway. His hand tightened slightly over hers. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Margaret lifted her chin. "No," she said honestly, "but we go anyway." A flicker of pride crossed his face. "Good." Instead of remaining near the walls like many couples would, Maximilian guided her directly toward the center of the ballroom. The orchestra began a waltz. He turned to her formally. "May I have this dance, Your Grace?" The title was deliberate, public, respectful. "You may." The waltz began. They moved smoothly across the floor together. Maximilian guided her effortlessly through each turn, his hand firm at her waist. Around them, eyes followed every step. "They are staring," she murmured. "Let them." "And what do you wish them to see?" His voice lowered near her ear. "The truth." "And what truth is that?" His arm tightened slightly. "That you are mine." Heat rose to her cheeks. "And you are mine," she replied softly. Something dark and pleased flickered in his eyes. The dance ended, and polite applause followed, but the whispers around them had only grown louder. They had barely stepped away from the floor when a familiar voice interrupted. "Well, if it is not the Duke of Kingsley." Margaret stiffened. Lord Ashford approached them. The same man who had once tried to purchase her life at a gaming table. He bowed stiffly. "Your Graces." Maximilian's expression turned instantly cold. "Ashford, I wish to offer congratulations," Ashford said smoothly. His eyes flicked toward Margaret. "A fortunate arrangement for everyone involved." The insult rested just beneath the politeness. Before Margaret could respond, Maximilian stepped forward. The movement was subtle, but dangerous. "You will address my wife properly." Ashford blinked. "I meant no offense. You implied she should be grateful for rescue." Maximilian's voice lowered. "She owes me nothing." The ballroom had grown quiet again. Ashford cleared his throat. "You misunderstand. I merely remarked upon her improved circumstances." Maximilian leaned slightly closer. "My wife's worth has never depended upon her circumstances." His voice dropped even lower. "If you speak of her again as though she were a purchased object, you will discover precisely how unpleasant I can be." Ashford paled. "I see." "Good." Maximilian nodded once. The dismissal was final. Ashford retreated quickly into the crowd. The music resumed. Conversation slowly returned, but Margaret could still feel the echo of what had just happened. "You did not have to defend me," she murmured. "I did." His voice was firm. "You are my Duchess." She looked at him quietly. "And your wife?" "Yes." He turned to face her fully. "And the woman I love." The words landed softly between them. Margaret's breath caught. "You have never said that before." "I should have." His gray eyes held hers steadily. "I love you, Margaret." The ballroom seemed to fade around them. The music, the whispers, the watching crowd. None of it mattered. "I love you too," she whispered. His hand rose slowly to her cheek. When he kissed her this time, it was not polite. It was not brief. It was warm and certain. When he finally drew back, he murmured softly near her ear, "Come home with me." 3 years later, the halls of Kingsley Park echoed with laughter. The great estate no longer felt like the silent house Margaret had first entered. It had become something warmer, something alive. A small girl ran down the long gallery, her laughter bouncing off the tall walls. "Papa!" Maximilian barely had time to look up from his desk before his daughter launched herself into his arms. Victoria Kingsley was 4 years old and entirely fearless. "You will terrify the entire peerage one day," he told her gravely. Victoria giggled. "I already do." From the doorway, Margaret watched the scene with quiet amusement. Once London had called the Duke of Kingsley cold, feared, untouchable. Now he sat on the library floor with his daughter in his lap and a wooden toy horse in one large hand. Margaret leaned against the doorframe. "You spoil her." "I prepare her," he replied calmly. "For what?" "To rule the world." Victoria nodded seriously. "I will." Margaret laughed softly. Their son Edmund slept upstairs, barely a year old, watched carefully by his nurse and a father who checked on him far more often than necessary. The staff had long since grown used to seeing their formidable duke carrying children through the halls. Later that evening, the house grew quiet. Margaret and Maximilian sat together beside the library fire, the same room where their friendship had first begun. "Do you ever think about that night at White's?" she asked softly. He did not need to ask which night. "The night everything began." "Sometimes." He leaned back in his chair, watching the flames. "I often think about how easily I could have walked away." "You would not have." "Perhaps not." His gaze moved to her. "But I did not intervene for noble reasons." She tilted her head. "No?" "I had already noticed you." The confession surprised her. "At several balls that season," he continued quietly. "You always stood at the edge of the room, watching everyone as though you understood the entire performance. And that interested you?" "It intrigued me." A faint smile touched his mouth. "When Ashford spoke your name that night, I knew exactly who he meant." "And you decided to buy me?" "Yes." The honesty made her laugh softly. "That sounds scandalous." "It is." "Are you angry?" She thought for a moment. Then she shook her head. "No." "Why not?" "Because you never treated me as something you owned." She moved closer and placed her hand over his. "You gave me time. You deserved it. You gave me respect. You earned it. And you gave me love." His fingers tightened around hers. "That was never a gift." "What was it then?" "Something you took from me the moment you walked into that drawing room and refused to be frightened." Firelight flickered across his face. "You were never a debt, Margaret." His voice softened. "You were always my destiny." Her eyes warmed. "And you were mine." Outside, the vast estate lay quiet beneath the stars. Inside, the Duke of Kingsley held the woman he had once purchased for £20,000. But the truth neither of them could deny was simple. He had not bought a wife. He had found the love that changed his life forever. And Margaret, the girl once sold to pay her father's debts, had discovered something greater than rescue. She had found a man who saw her not as a bargain, not as a solution, but as the one person he would choose again and again for the rest of his life.